Where's my tea? Oh, what's up, everybody? This is Chris from Brooklyn Wildlife, and you are watching slash listening to Just for My People. And today, our special guest is.
Emma Kaywin. Hi, nice to meet you, everybody.
How are you doing? How are you doing today?
It's a weird question in the pandemic, but I'm doing all right considering. How are you?
I'm doing well. I literally never can answer that question properly. When people ask like, "So how are you feeling?" I get hit with the like, Are we doing the small talk version, or do you actually want to know how I'm feeling? And if we get into it, or is everyone able to handle all that? But but really, I was wondering like, how have you been? Like you in a more literal sense of how have you adapted to the changes? What are we doing with ourselves these days?
Yeah, well, so it's really interesting. So half of my work has gotten more because I'm a professional grant writer, and so I'm writing all these grants for nonprofits all over New York City to get extra funding.
Right.
So I'm getting more money that way and more work. But then I work in nightlife, and none of that is happening. So it sort of I there was like a rebalancing thing that happened, and that was really interesting. And then most of my friends have lost their jobs
Right.
because most of my friends are artists. And but then I used to work at Mount Sinai, so I have all these friends who are in healthcare. So I'm on these text chains where I'm like hearing all of the insider fucked up stuff that's happening in all of the different hospitals. And just how underserved they are. And so like I'm sort of getting it from like all these different sides. It's really interesting and intense.
Wow, that's in a good way as well as not so good way. It's really turbulent. Like a lot is different for you. For people that aren't familiar with you, can you do a brief bio? Like where you from? What do you do with yourself? Like
Yeah.
who is Emma?
Okay, so I was born in Berkeley, California. You can hear my Californian accent, but I've been living in New York City since 2006. My background is I worked in HIV for a while, doing a lot of education and training. And then now what I'm doing is a mix of things. So I make my money by being a grant writer, mostly for healthcare organizations. But then I also work in nightlife. I run consent and safety programs for a lot of bars and clubs all across the United States, mostly on the East Coast. The big name droppy ones are House of Yes in New York and Mezzo Crezo down in DC. But I do a lot of work with that, and I'm really interested in models of rehabilitation for people who have harmed others, and also trying to create spaces that everyone feels really awesome in as much as we can, um, without being policing.
Right.
And so I do that, and then I'm also in grad school for to get a doctorate in health education, and I'm doing my doctoral research on how queer people navigate nightlife spaces and create feelings of safety and joy for themselves. So yeah, that's me.
Word. Word in a nutshell.
Yeah.
So for people that are unfamiliar with the language and the jargon, what are some of the issues or what are some of the things that come up when you're dealing with nightlife and consent? And how can you, in working with a venue, help create an environment that fosters more safety?
Yeah, that's a big question. So I guess the jargon thing is like, so with basically the idea of consent is new to a lot of people our age and even younger. It has been like the idea of like offering consent and consenting to do something, like to want to do something, has been around obviously for a while with sex and with everything. Like when we teach kids about consent, we say like, if someone steals your toy and you didn't say that was okay and it's stealing, not offering, like, how does that feel? So, like, the idea of consent has been around for a while, but it really came into the forefront with the Me Too movement, which was resuscitated in, I think, October of 2017 um, by Alyssa Milano. It had been a Tarana Burke thing before that. And people started, Harvey Weinstein everyone started kind of looking at people's behavior differently and believing that people have negative things happen to them. And in nightlife, it's really complicated, right? Because people are drinking, people are on drugs, some people are there to be with their friends, some people are there to hook up. And all of those things are like completely valid things to do at a club. So how do you make sure that what you want to do doesn't like bump up against what someone else wants to do in a way that makes them feel bad? And the thing that's really complicated is that we don't really have a taught language of how to speak about this. Instead, what we have is a lot of scripts that are very gendered and also have a lot of other isms in them. Like there's a lot of race and ethnicity involved in this as well, but predominantly gendered scripts about how men and women, assuming that there are just two categories, which there aren't, sort of handle flirtation and handle sex. So like the dominant script, we call it in the field, is like women have to be chaste because like they aren't sexual, and they have to be sort of like a no means a yes, and men have to chase and they have to like show that they're like dominant. I mean, obviously these are things that are in like every movie ever, so even though they sound really dumb when I say them like that, like go back and watch any movie from the 90s and you'll see this. I mean, even it's happening now.
Yeah, I mean, that doesn't sound in my mind like dumb or far-fetched. If you, again, look at movies from the 70s, 80s, you go back farther, literally almost every movie from like the 50s and 60s, there's an aggressive nature to the male-female dynamic that's somewhat rooted in contention and kind of force or bullying in a weird way. And even speaking to young people now, if I ask folks about expectations, and I'm kind of like to 15-year-olds, if you want to speak to somebody, do you have a right to invade their space, or do you wait for them to speak to you? Why do you think it matters if you want to do something? And you can watch them like, what do you mean? Like, as a guy, I'm supposed to go holler. And as a girl, I don't go holler. But obviously there's some fluidity with that these days, but you still find the traditionalism pretty prevalent.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's still definitely there. And that's one big thing is like, how do we break the cycle of that?
Right. And so with what you're doing, you're working with venues to try to establish either policy or kind of frameworks for discussions, language, or how do you go about making that change?
Yeah, so what I do with venues is I work with them so basically the thing that I'll say first is like, we don't really know what works the best in doing this because they haven't done the research yet. And that's what I'm doing in my doctoral work, is starting to do the research to actually say like, this is an evidence-based thing. Like we, tried this in 10 different cities and it worked. So like, try it, it'll probably be good. Right now, what I do is I take things from different areas where there is more research and I try them in venues where I'm pretty confident that it's going to be useful. And I'm not just talking about like peer-reviewed, like ivory tower research. I'm also talking about, forums. I read a lot of blogs. The BDSM community is amazing for talking a lot about how they navigate safety. So a lot of what I do is based on the S&M community, which is fun. And so what I do is for venues, the most important thing is that they're trauma informed. And so trauma informed care is a thing that people have created for hospitals and healthcare settings, which is like, if I come in and I'm traumatized, like, how do you treat me so that you don't traumatize me more?
Right.
And we can assume in New York City that a lot of people are traumatized for various reasons and have trauma in their history and have experienced negative experiences. So you can assume that people going to a club, those people are also going to have traumatic experiences. And if someone grabs them at the club, they might not really like it, probably won't, but not for everybody. And so for a club or a venue, it's about like, what do the staff do? Like, what do they need to know in order to be compassionate and supportive? If you go to the meatpacking district and you go clubbing there, and if I went there and someone grabbed my ass and I went up to the security guard and said, this person grabbed my ass, like, what's the chance that person would be kicked out?
Right.
Like, very slim, because they don't have a policy. And so part of what I do is train staff and help them create policies. And then something that I'm working on now is trying to figure out like what to do next. So right now there are actually a lot of clubs, some of them that I work with, and then some like nowadays that have other awesome staff who are doing similar work, who are coming up with ways to sort of like protect the core of their community And so then there are people being pushed out of the core, right? So what happens to those people? And so I actually just created a resource guide for New York City for perpetrators of harm, of like all the places that you can go. Like someone kicks you out of the club or tells you that you harmed them, like what do you do? And there are actually a lot of really great places that are local, and so a lot of them are free, that you can go to and like go to a men's circle or get go to a group or go to therapy or do a restorative justice circle. And so that's sort of like external to the clubs and bars, but I think
Right.
that that is super important.
Yeah, I mean, this is interesting in the parallelisms to some of the experiences I've had in working in a high school or volunteering in a high school in the past couple of years. You have certain students that have overstepped boundaries, have possibly hurt other students or been violent in certain ways or exhibited quote unquote problematic behavior. And there is no reintroduction back into society part. And so they end up stigmatized for the rest of their high school career. It may have happened in ninth grade. And by 11th grade, there's still teachers and students who are like, don't talk to them. They're a bad person. And there's no process for them to come back into the fold or to have an opportunity for, in a way, like redemption. And
Mm-hmm.
it's complicated because you do want to keep people safe and you do want to make sure that people know that a certain behavior can't be tolerated. So where's that balance?
Yeah, well, so restorative justice and transformative justice does happen in schools sometimes. So there are some schools that run transformative justice circles, and I know some of those people, so maybe we can get one on the show because it's super interesting, but I'm not an expert.
Right.
But there's also this thing about like the axiom, like hurt people hurt people.
Right.
So like a lot of people who come to school are traumatized. Like they're living in homes where there's violence, they're impoverished, so they don't have all the things that they need, they're not eating well. Like there are all these things that contribute to students coming into class and like freaking out, you know? And
Yeah.
if you're not taking a trauma-informed school approach, then what you get is like stigmatizing these kids. And then if you don't have a way to like help them learn different behaviors, like basically in a nutshell, like the way people react when they're traumatized is it's a survival mechanism. And so it works at home, let's say. Like, let's say, if your parents are fighting all the time, like it works to just like go away, like, dissociate from your body. So then you do that all the time because like it works. Your brain doesn't need to come up with new things. But what if your mechanism is like to fight back, which is a lot of people's? Then you go into class and someone, says some shit to you and suddenly you're like punching your classmate when really
Right.
what you want to do is like punch your mom. And then suddenly you're like, in a suspension school, exactly what you're saying.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. I'm glad that there's some venues and folks open to it. For me, that's also been an issue with nightlife and doing events as much as I have. Where do you find the responsibility? And for me, because we do things that are so rooted in DIY and like we're fully responsible, we don't really have the leeway. Like a meatpacking district club can be like, hey, that's not my issue. For me, almost anyone at our event, it's somebody I know, and anyone causing problems is someone I know. And so I kind of have to get involved in it,
Yeah.
which puts me in between sometimes. No matter what I do, everyone's mad at me. Like, like both
Yeah.
parties end up feeling they didn't get what they should have. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. So I think it's very important, like you assisting people with that.
Yeah. And what I would say to that is like it is best practice to not have the person throwing the party be the person having these conversations. Because point one, you're busy. Like you have other shit to do, but also because like I might not feel comfortable telling you, like let's say I just came to your party for the first time and like I haven't been to a wildlife party in like 5 years, and then I came and then and I know that it's a community space, and then someone gropes me at the party or someone says some like homophobic shit to me at the party. I know that you probably know that person because like everybody, so it's going to be very scary for me to come and talk to you. But someone who's like a little bit more impartial, who's like not as much in the scene, can be a very good foil and like escalate things to you and be like, yo, I need to kick this person out, or like this person's not listening to me, like them, can you talk to them? But to start off with, to have someone who's like a little bit apart, I think is really useful.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. And so speaking of some of your experience in working with like trauma informed approaches, one of the things we were going to discuss is how this time period in Shutter Inside is kind of triggering or actualizing people's previous trauma, and maybe some self-care techniques they may be able to implement, or some things to be aware of when it comes to that. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, definitely. So essentially, there's a couple of different things going on right now that are traumatizing. So first of all, there are people who are dying, and if you know someone who's died, that is traumatic. That is like literally a trauma, and you can be feeling traumatic response based on that. Everybody who is inside is experiencing like loss of control, which can feel really bad for people. Some people are stuck in places that are not safe. Like, I'm in a house with people I love who I trust. But that's not true of a lot of people, especially in family situations. So there can be actual trauma happening in the homes.
Right.
Um, and then I would say I would categorize like the loss of community and loss of community spaces as a grief state. Like we're grieving right now. Like I'm in deep grief for like queer nightlife. Like I don't know what it's going to look like when it comes back. I don't know if we're going to be allowed to come back in the way that we have been. Places are closing down. I'm in deep grief from like my small business friends who are really struggling, and all my friends. So like people are grieving as well. So that's one thing, which is what's happening with COVID. And then the other thing is people who have experienced trauma in the past can be triggered by all of these experiences. And so triggered is a word that we use a lot to mean a lot of different things, but the actual definition is you go back in time and re-experience what you experienced when you had a traumatic experience. So like something really, really bad happened. You got into a car accident, let's say. If you hear a really loud noise, you can get triggered, and you actually like your body floods you with all the same hormones, all the same stress hormones that you got when you were in the car accident, like when you were freaked out right before you got hit, let's say. And then you experience that and you really feel like you're there. Like
Right.
really, really, really feel like you're there. So that's what being triggered means. It doesn't just mean like being uncomfortable or like not wanting to do a homework assignment or something. It's like a real thing. So another word that we could use is activated, because triggered means like so many things right now.
Yeah.
So people can be triggered also because they had bad things happen to them, and now this is also really stressful.
Yeah, I mean, it in a obviously different capacity. It's similar to the concept of with folks who are dealing with PTSD, or when folks who are talking about like military folks and veterans being quote unquote shell shocked, or like certain things. Yeah, take them right back to the experience or moment or emotional connection. But there's also a physiological aspect to it, is what you're talking about, that it's not just a cognitive or emotional concept, but that literally their body is activating.
Yeah, exactly. So to answer the second part of your question, which is what do you do? So there's a lot of things that you can do, but the thing that you can do with triggering is really cool. It sounds really dumb, but it's called grounding. And basically, because you're like back in time, you're not here. The point is to like get your mind back here where you are actually safe. So yes, we are shuttered in place. Yes, the world is scary, but like I'm sitting in my chair right now and I am safe. So the way that you do grounding, and you can do it to yourself or you can help someone else through it, is there's three different types. There's visual grounding, which is like I would look around the room and I would just count everything that's blue in the room until I calm down.
Right.
There's physical grounding, which is like I feel my feet on the ground, I feel my butt on the chair. Or there's mantra grounding, which is like telling yourself over and over again, like I am safe, I am loved. And people like different ones. I like the visual one the best for me, but everyone's really different.
Now, can I ask you a question I'm not going to be speaking for myself. I'm going to be taking the perspective of maybe some friends that I have, and by no means do I want to offend you. I'm asking you honestly how you would speak to someone who may present the idea that I'm going to present. What if someone were to say, all this psychoanalysis, psychology, kind of therapeutic approaches is white people stuff, and in the world of marginalized communities or Black community, life has always been hard, and you don't have the room to be triggered by anything. you adapt. What do you say to people who would approach it like that?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of communities that have a ton of trauma and a ton of what we call chronic trauma, which is like acute trauma is like I got hit by a car or like one thing bad thing happened once. Chronic trauma is like I grew up in a home where I was traumatized all the time or I was in a relationship for a long time that like really drew out and it was traumatic the whole time. So the populations that you're talking about have a lot of chronic trauma. And people take a lot of pride in their resiliency. And no one says you should take away resiliency. That's like extremely important. Trauma therapy tends to what they do is they help you think through like all the things that you do to protect yourself and find where some of those things might not be the most useful. So like to go back to the example of like I used to fight a lot as a kid, but now I'm like working in an office setting and I just get angry all the time and I yell at my colleagues. Like, okay, so maybe anger is like not working for you anymore. What is something else that you could do instead? And it like helps you think through that. I do think that um, that in a lot of ways, psychoanalysis in particular is white people stuff. But there are a lot of people who've translated it into more like minority focused spaces. And people who are of those backgrounds do that.
Right.
And that really works. And like as an example, I'm friends with someone who there was like a lot of postnatal depression in these women in Africa. But they like wouldn't go to a, a class or a support group, like absolutely not. So they created like a play group for all the kids. So all the kids were hanging out and they were like getting childcare, and then the moms were hanging out and doing crafts and like started talking about their feelings then. So there's like all sorts of ways that you can support people,
Right.
as long as it's like, relevant and also affordable, uh, which a lot of psychotherapy is not. But some trauma therapy in New York City is free. So
Right. Right. I mean, and again, it's not my personal take on it, but it's something I run into in speaking to certain groups of not just young people, but some of the artists I'm around, or I mean, in all reality, a lot of older Black people I've talked to are very not just cautious, but suspicious and skeptical when it comes to therapy, when it comes to speaking to anyone besides your like close homies or a priest, um, which has some interesting components to it. And I believe because of the jargon or language, I do have some friends who immediately are like, "Oh, you using that woke language," or like, "Oh, you talking that, you know, snowflake, frilly, I'm too soft language." And for me, I see it in the arts community how many of us are sorting through previous experiences, traumas, conflicts, and part of why we do art is a constant cathartic experience and a constant, I think, aim to figure out issues within ourselves, but we don't really want to get into it sometimes. And so I want to give you the opportunity to let people know that like it may be a bit more variegated, or there may be more options than they're aware of.
yeah, well, and you mentioned artists, and like art therapy is a real thing. And I'm not trained in it and I've never done it, but I know a lot of people who are. And like art therapy and music therapy is really cool. There's like a lot of different things and like they all have the word therapy in them. But like grounding, for instance, like grounding is essentially a name for like get your head on right. Like it's not like it's evidence-based because people tried it, probably because people were doing it and they figured out that it was helpful, and then they started telling other people to do it. But I think that it can be really, really useful. I mean, other things that you can do for people who are traumatized or for yourself is like the main one is just like normalizing that it's a really real reasonable response to respond however you're responding when something traumatic happens. So people are doing that a lot right now, where people are saying, like, of course you're having more panic attacks. Of course you're depressed. Like, we're all shut in for an indeterminate amount of time. A lot of us have lost money. Everyone has lost community. Like, people are dying. Like, this is not a chill situation. However
Right.
you're reacting to it is normal. And normalizing things, normalizing responses to trauma actually has been found to help people not develop post traumatic stress disorder symptoms. So just telling someone, like, yeah, that makes total sense is like a beautiful thing that you can do. And that's like not white people shit. That's like everyone shit.
I mean, again, I can't speak for the entire Black community, but there are definitely times like when we went out to California, my homie got his car broken into, lost his laptop, was really like sad. His whole album was on it. And it was so funny seeing the different takes based on like race when we got back. And we, one of my homies was talking to another friend and was like, yeah, they broke in the car. The first response, my homie was like, you leave the backpack in the front seat? And they were like, what? Yo, I got my shit stolen. It was like, man, that's your fault. And it was the weirdest, like no empathy, no sympathy. And it reminded me of growing up that there were definitely certain members of the community that obviously would be supportive and be empathetic, but a whole nother group that are like, what happened? We're going to blame you first. You're going to have to prove you didn't do something wrong before we give you that empathy. And so I think there's a hill sometimes to climb for people to get into the space of saying, you know what, it's not my fault. I am responding in a reasonable way.
Mm-hmm. Well, and what you also talk about, we talk about a lot in about rape, where like people get blamed for getting raped all the time. So it's like, what were you wearing? Why were you there? Blah blah. Like, and then when you bring, like gender and race into it, then it's like, okay, so like you exist while trans and black. Like, can you even be raped? There were laws where like until the 70s in the United States, if you were married and you were a woman, you couldn't be legally raped. And if you were a sex worker, you couldn't be raped legally for like a very, very long time. And it's still really hard to prove. You have to like prove that you were raped, which is like absurd.
Right.
So, it's the same sort of thing.
Yeah. And so for folks that have been having difficulties managing this time period, you have grounding and you have some other, I think, options or ideas for them. What would you say? What would you suggest if they're not able to go seek any therapy while we're shuttered in, or they don't have access to a support group right now?
Yeah, well, so there are a lot of places that are doing things online. If like you want a professional, like I would look at the Crime Victims Treatment Center, which is in New York, and they provide free treatment support. And there are also like amazing hotlines. There's this one called Crisis Text Line that's a text message hotline, and they're open all the time. So like there's always someone there who can help. But other things that you can do is like something that I've been noticing that people have been talking about a lot is like people are like, well, we're shuttered in. Like, when are you going to write your next novel? And, like, I hope you're still doing your deliverables. And like, fuck that. Honestly, I mean, everyone deserves downtime. And, like maybe you're going to write your next album, Chris, or maybe you're going to like sleep a lot because you're depressed because this is fucked up. And, we don't need to all come out of this like bettered. We need to survive this.
Yeah.
So that's a big thing. And I think it's really important. And especially anyone listening who is still working and manages people, like helping people who they manage take the time that they need. Because I know a lot of my friends who are still working are feeling really trapped because their bosses are pretending like nothing is happening. It's like, oh, now you don't have a commute. It's like, well, things are really different than just not commuting. This is not like a working from home standard experience.
Right. Right.
And then, so that's one thing. I'm going to use the term self-care, which is like another hot button word that is meaningless. But for me, self-care does not mean like I ate some chocolate. It's like I am deeply taking care of myself at all the times. And I'm not very good at it, but maybe other people are. And just thinking about, what can you actually do every day to engage in self-care? And there's some really beautiful guides that are already out of like, go outside every day, do something nice for yourself every day. And if you're a list person, you can make a list. But thinking through in healthcare, there's this beautiful quote which about self-care, which is you have an ethical imperative not to be damaged by the work that you do. So a lot of us are doing a lot of mutual aid and are like really throwing ourselves into mutual aid. And also the thing to remember is like, try not to come out of this more damaged than you need to. And then, and Audre Lorde called self-care a radical political act. Um,
Right.
and she was talking about it as from a Black person who has had cancer and was like, I'm taking care of myself, fuck all of you. But I think that also is good for everyone. It's like, yeah, especially those of us with different types of minority status, it's like, yeah, I'm going to take care of myself because this is really scary. And the people in charge will not be kind to any of us, you know?
Well, yeah, I mean, without getting, well, with getting super personal, we know each other. So, like, I got diagnosed with melanoma last summer and got my pinky toe amputated. I'm still doing immunotherapy, and my treatment was postponed. And I was like stuck on the fence. Like, the doctor was like, you can come in, but you're risking getting a respiratory disease, and the medication you're on can already cause you respiratory problems. So, it's probably not worth the risk. And I felt pulled like, no, 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 I need to get my treatment, which I, before I started, was terrified of because it could have possibly really bad side effects. But now that I've started it, it's like, all right, fine, I'm going to do it. Let's do it. Then it's like, all right, COVID pops up, and so I can't get my treatment, but I want my treatment. But is the my fear of cancer coming back stronger than my fear of getting a respiratory illness that could kill me? What do I do? And then I'm in the house like, well, I gotta make stuff. Like I gotta do more than I ever did, because like, what if I gotten really, really, really sick and could never make anything? And like, I feel pressured to like do the best I've ever done in my life. But then it's like, yo, it's a damn pandemic going around the globe. I'm not really inspired to make rap music and perform it to a computer screen to try to stream to people and ask them to donate with a tip bucket. It's just not, I'm not in a super creative place, right now. And so I'm feeling all these things simultaneously and have no idea what I'm supposed to be doing.
Yeah, well, I think there isn't one right answer, and people are doing really different things, right? So some people are like taking shelter in place to mean like I'm never leaving my house. And some people have created germ circles. And then some people are like, some people are partying on the block, which, that one feels a little bit more like maybe you should listen to the guidance a little bit more. But everyone's creating their own risk assessment, and you're creating your own risk assessment. And we don't know, like, I don't know if you would have like a horrible outcome if you got COVID. It seems likely that you would have a less positive one than if you were not on this medication. But like, they don't even know, like, even if I was a doctor, I wouldn't have that knowledge yet to tell you
Right.
because it's so new. And so like, the uncertainty is terrifying for everybody, and everybody's feeling it in different ways.
Yeah. Yeah. And so for you personally, have you been able to walk around, get out, get some sunshine? Are you able to do some things that are unrelated to your work and unrelated to any of these responsibilities?
Yeah, so I've been sheltering in place in two different houses in Bushwick. So I've been walking between them every few days. And both of them have really nice, like tiny but nice backyards, which is lovely. So I've been, doing that. And I'm from California, so this is freezing for me. But when it gets warmer, I'll be outside. I already got my first white girl burn on my tits. Great. Um, but and then what we've been doing in one of the houses is we've been doing a lot of organizing of artists and makers. So we started, actually, Jesse Lost Boy started this really awesome website, Pandemic Performers, that I've been helping with a little bit. And we have a calendar and of performances and classes that people can look at, and a newsletter that goes out every week. And you should be on that, actually. And then,
I am. I sent them the info.
oh, perfect. And
Yeah.
then we also have Pandemic Makers, which is for makers and small businesses. And the idea there is buy your holiday presents now, like buy that birthday present now and give these people money when they need it. And so that one's up, and that one's fun. And then we've been doing a lot of really funny, like art projects just for us. We have Pandemic Poet Sluts is an Instagram account that's really funny. That's all erotic poetry that we're reading.
What's that account
It's
again?
called Pandemic Poet Sluts.
Okay.
And that one's really fun, and people can, it's collaborative. People can send in their poetry and their videos of them sexily reading poetry. And it's just, but we're doing that because that's how we're handling it at this moment.
Right.
And I'm doing a lot of cooking, which is really fun. And yeah, that's sort of how, and I'm doing all this work that I feel is still sort of relevant. And that also helps. I think people who I felt this the same way when Trump got elected, that everybody who was lefty and liberal went into an immediate and deep depression. But the people who really, really went into a deep depression were people whose jobs had nothing to do with solving that problem. And then people who were still helping in some way, like they were making political art, they were working in a hospital where they were helping people who were underserved, they were working in politics, seemed like we were doing a little bit better. And I was working at a hospital then. And so I feel
Okay.
like now people who are like they have a job, but like their job is irrelevant, are having a harder time because they're not getting that 40 hours in of just like, I've helped in the world for 40 hours. Now I can like go fuck off.
Yeah, I mean, I have no idea what it's like for folks who still have to go to work and are afraid every time they go out that they could be making themselves sick or whoever they live with sick when they come home. On the other side, for the people that want to go to work and can't, then the people like who work in nightlife where there is no job and they don't know if the venue is going to open back up. They're not just furloughed. Like, it was interesting. I was speaking to my friend who works in fashion, and they were like, "Oh, I got let go," and I was like, "Really? Like, that's horrible. What are you going to do?" And she was like, "Well, I'm furloughed," and I'm like, "Oh." I get your discomfort, but that's different than my friend that got let go. Like, you're getting paid while not at work, and you will possibly have a job when it reopens. My other homie got cut. Like, there's no
Yeah.
payment coming. There's no reopening. They moved back to where they grew up, you know?
Yeah, it is really different. And we also like we don't know what the economy is going to look like when this comes back. My little sister is a chef, and I'm pretty confident that, a lot of, I mean, definitely some smaller restaurants are going to close, but the restaurant business is going to open back up the second that they can, because the restaurant business is a big part of what makes New York great. And so they're going to put a lot of money into that. But what they're not putting a lot of money into is all the other things that make New York great, like all the weird artists and all those little hole in the wall places that are, serve food or are bars, or, these places are things that I'm really worried about. Um, and there's no telling what it's going to really look like and how much we're going to be able to gather and what that will be like.
Yeah, from some of the people I've spoken to who are in the same situation as us, we run a DIY art space. So we weren't registered as a LLC. Like, we're not profitable. And so we didn't go through the process of being like a business per se. So we're not eligible for tons of these loans. And folks are like, well, you can still get it. It's a payroll, this and that. And I'm like, we don't have a payroll. We don't pay. There's no money to pay people. We pay rent. That's like,
Yeah.
and sure, at some of the events, we're able to generate some revenue, or there are people that rent our space, but we don't, it's not set up like that. And so I know there are tons of art spaces and community spaces that are in our boat, to where if they don't get donations or they didn't just have somehow like 3 months rent saved up, they're going to have to close.
Yeah, well, and I think you bring up a really interesting point about legitimizing things, because I mean we both like love underground spaces, and it never occurred to me that like an underground space would be at particular risk for anything in particular, because it's like they're underground, this is just how we do it. But then thinking about now, it's like, well, if the government doesn't know about you, then you can't get this aid. And then again, of course, like the aid is already used up, I mean. But thinking about, from a grant writer's perspective, being a nonprofit is always a good idea, because then you can get way more grants than you can get if you're a for-profit or if you're an individual. So I've always thought that being a nonprofit is the best from the perspective of just getting people to fund different projects that you have. But
Right, right.
yeah, I mean, it's so interesting. I mean, I think a lot about how this particular thing happened and cut community in a very specific way, but other things could have happened or could happen in the future that will cut community in a very different way. I think back about the AIDS crisis in the 80s, and it cut community in extremely different ways. And people were similarly worried about getting ill, but there was like different communities that were siloed and different, like it just changed the way that we interact in a very different way. And then the depression, which I've been thinking about a lot, cut community in a very different way. Also, it also really messed up our economic space, but it didn't mess up our community space in the same way. So, in a slightly different world where we could hang out, but let's say like the stock market crashed, your space would be awesome because like we would be doing mutual aid out of your space and throwing parties all the time.
Right.
So it's just
yeah,
like there's no way to plan because you can't plan for everything.
I mean, it's also like when something happens once in a century, it's just like one of those weird things of, all right, my mom was right. Like all the paranoia and all the like, you never know what can happen kind of talk. And I'm like, no, that type of shit never happens. What are you worried about? It's like, this is what the old people talk about. All right.
Well, because they're depression era, like they learned from their parents, and also there are people who can say that this will happen again. That this is very likely to happen again. Not exactly this, like not this disease, but new diseases that we don't have, that we haven't had before, ripping through communities that through globalization you can't really contain. This is something that people have been warning about for a while.
Yeah, I mean, it's also interesting where society is, or where the people in charge of society or elected officials or the people who are able to disperse these funds are deciding who and what it can go to. So one of the conversations I've been having with folks who are sex workers are those who are kind of on paper and are able to somehow still get the unemployment, or who are able to say that they are self-employed entrepreneurs, versus some to where if they identify at all what they're doing, they risk putting themselves in the scope of getting in legal trouble, and they don't have any assistance, but are already kind of in a space of marginalization and instability. And so they definitely would be in a group of some of the most need and can't get it.
Absolutely.
And seeing how this all plays out has been really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, there are some nonprofits that do disperse funds to sex workers. And also, I have a lot of friends who have asked me for specific sex workers' Venmos and have given money. So there is like a little bit of mutual aid going on, but I mean, the government is not going to help. The government, there's like this very like conservative way of thinking, which is like, if I don't like something, I can just pretend it doesn't exist and it will go away. Where I'm more of like a harm reduction model, which is like, people are going to do what they're going to do. Let's give them the tools to like do it in the most safe way possible. And I know a lot of sex workers that I'm friends with have been getting solicitations of like, are you coming? Can you come this week? And they're like, no, like, absolutely not, But like, if you're desperate enough because, we don't have a rent strike and you don't have money to feed yourself, like you might put yourself at that risk. And that would be a completely reasonable thing to do. But like, why make people make that decision,
Wait, you're going in and out, like that your whole last sentence after you said like people are being solicited, you're going in and out.
Oh, just that people are being solicited and, are not, the people I know are not seeing clients right now. But if you don't have a rent freeze and you don't have enough money to eat, you might make that decision that would not be in your best health interest. And like, who can blame you, honestly? It's like,
yeah, wow. Well, I mean, this is there's so many different layers. I guess, do you have any resources or links that I should post below here, or do you want to post anything or send to me in the chat?
Yeah.
Yeah, if you send me in the, like, we have a personal chat here. I just sent you a note in it. If you want to send me any links, I'll post below this. And I think we're about to wrap up, but are there any things that you want to let people know or tell people before we head out?
Um, I don't know. I think the thing to be the thing to think about the most that I think about the most right now is like trying to figure out how to be kind to yourself because we're all traumatized. And then think through how can we, when you have the spoons, how can you lay the foundation for the world that you want to have after this? Because everyone's talking about how we're going to go back to the way things were. And that's also a very conservative, like, nobody, like, no brown person likes the way things were. No queer person likes the way things were. We can all do a lot better. And so thinking about like there's all of this beautiful organizing and mutual aid and support of strangers and all this stuff happening right now. And I'm trying to figure out how we can what we can do now to try to make sure that it stays and that the world gets better after this instead of worse or the same.
Yeah, I think that's something important. I've seen a couple either memes or pieces of art going around, and they're basically like, if you were okay with going back to normal, we might want to question our sense of normalcy, or might want to question our awareness of how normal was working for other people, and use this in a way as
Yeah.
an opportunity of we can reset the table. We can at this point look at the board and say, you know what, certain things weren't working, and here's an opportunity to balance some playing field.
Yeah, exactly. And I also think that a lot of what's happening right now with the government is unmasking for more people how unequal the world is, or how at least how unequal our world is in the United States. Because
Right.
like most of the small business association fund money went to hedge funds because they listed themselves as small businesses and that was allowed. And so like Gamba didn't get money, but a hedge fund did. Like fuck, like Shake
Yeah.
Shack did. Fuck off. So I would
Yeah.
say that's something that's useful.
Word. All right. Well, thank you again. This has been Just for My People interview series that I'm doing with friends and family about various topics. I'm Chris Carr, your host, representing Brooklyn Wildlife and Gamba Forest. And our guest today was...
Emma Kaywin, so nice to chat with you.
Yeah, and I can't wait till things get back to not normal, but to where when we can go outside and see each other again. Because I believe the last time I saw you was at House of Yes.
Yeah, probably for Naughty for Nature.
Yeah, and that was a awesome show. Shout out to Nate Hilla, Anya, and all the folks, Kay at House of Yes. That was an amazing night.
Yeah, so good. Yeah.
All right.
Lovely
Well,
rest of your day.
awesome. Well, thank you very much. And we are signing off.